So we're so happy to have this presentation by Yoon Won, who's a wonderful PhD student here at Emory and member of our lab. So great to have you back with us, Yoon Won. And she will be talking about her amazing research in South Korea. So please take it away, Yoon Won.
Thank you so much for inviting me to the Emory Keio seminar series. It's really an honor to be here. I've always missed presenting to the lab, and I miss just being back at the lab. But hopefully we can do it this coming fall when I'm back in Atlanta. It's especially meaningful for me because, as Fujio Sensei was mentioning, Korea, the suicide prevention policies have been in much contact with the Japanese. Suicide prevention policies, but also the grief groups and the suicide survivor communities. And so it's really interesting to be in this collaborative space to share ideas about the situations in two different countries. So the presentation today is going to be about a particular chapter in my bigger dissertation project where I talk about both the biopolitics of the suicide prevention policies and how it impacts the processes of mourning for survivors in Korea. And this particular chapter is about a theater performance that I was a part of that was staged last November. And so without further ado, I will go directly into the presentation. Yeah. The title of my talk today is "The Performing for Failure, Embodying Grief After Loss by Suicide on Stage." Before we're going further into the talk, I do want to give you a trigger warning that this presentation contains vivid descriptions of suicide and its methods, especially at the beginning of the presentation. So if you feel like you don't want to hear about this particular part, feel free to go out of the Zoom link for a little bit and then come back. So let me come back to the presentation. I'd like to show you a audio clip that I put together from one of the rehearsal sessions of the play. This is a scene particularly deleted from the final staging of this play. Without further ado, I'll just play the audio. Can you hear the sound? Oh, sorry.
정말 갈 거라고 생각을 안 했던 거죠. 아니. 생각을 안 한 게 아니라 제가 안 믿었어요. 안 믿었어요. 애가 아프다는 걸. 그 정도로 무너져 있다는 걸. 그냥 그런 게 있어요. 엄마로서 인정하고 싶지 않은 게 있거든요. 그러니까 그러다가 결국 날이 온 건데 목매단 채로 있는 다미를 너무 급하게 내려놓고 제가 소생술을 직접 했거든요. 하면서 막 기도를 했어요. 괜찮아. 야 괜찮아. 아니 이거 의식 차릴 거야. 살릴 수 있어. 다미야 엄마가 살려줄게. 다미야 우리 또 엄마가 부르면 와야지. 다미야 죄송해요.
So this was a scene where Yeol, a character that depicts a mother of a child who died by suicide, and the moment she found the body of her daughter hanging and taking her down, to still thinking, hoping that she would come back to life after a CPR and fail, and then failing on it. And so this was written into the original script, but was deleted from the actual performance at the end. And I really want to dive into what it meant that this particular scene had to be deleted, which comes down to thinking about the embodying the pain of grief that one can't really talk about or speak about. And there's a saying in Korean called 간장지혜, which means which refers to grief that resembles the pain of one's gut being torn. And this particular phrase is depicting not any grief, but specifically the grief of parents who lost their children. And so they say usually when I'm in the field in interviews that this particular phrase is quite literal. People, in many cases, people have somatic experiences of their grief, and so their intestines do develop a lot of infestational problems. People end up having a lot of immune problems, inflammation on their skins, are particular problems people suffer with as well. And so when there are physical symptoms that sort of overwhelms individuals' understanding of their own grief, it's if there's that severity of the pain, could others really understand this pain, understand this type of pain, or could others really approximate this type of pain? Is the question that I'm trying to answer. Because inevitably, if the actors wanted to display or perform the type of grief on stage, they have to embody it and to represent it in a particular way. And so the scene that I just showed you was deleted from the final act because the actor was feeling a sort of unresolvedness of how to call the daughter's name, which was Tommy at the end. And so she tried many different ways of saying it. And the tone, nuance, and the expression of the scene constantly changed in every practice run. As I will say later, the practice run they basically rehearsed the play for about 3 weeks, and in every single practice run, she performed this particular scene in a very different way. And so the scene was deleted literally the day before the final stage rehearsal, which was a very big change for their performance at the very last minute. And the director said when they wanted to delete the scene that the scene was quote unquote unstable, or rather dangerous to put on stage, and thus made the decision to delete it. To connect this particular scene back to the bigger research questions that I have specifically for this chapter are the following. What does it mean to attempt to embody unspeakable and unimaginable grief? Especially when we talk about how embodied pain, has the fundamental impossibilities of communicating to others. And how does the creative team execute this set to be impossible task when they launched this project itself? How does the audience, both the survivors and non-survivors, react to such a performance? Do they empathize with the performed grief? And so I did conduct a audience poll right after the performance was done, and 50% of the audience identified themselves as the survivors of suicide loss, and the other 50% didn't, which is later questioned more in my interviews, which I'll delve into more in the later part of my presentation. And I also ask, does the performance allow for collective catharsis or healing among those experiencing it? And if so, what does it look like? And if not, what about grief prohibits this? When I was getting into this project as an ethnographer, there was a hunch for me that this performance itself in this very dark theater, people just like sitting together, witnessing this whirlwind of emotions on stage created through grief might create an atmosphere of almost a ritual of a kind for the dead, which it partially did. But then it didn't really happen in the cathartic way that I sort of expected it to be. And so I want to go into the reasons why it didn't. And if it wasn't the catharsis or almost like a ritualistic performance that a lot of people expect it to be, what does it generate is the ultimate question I wanted to ask. Let me get into the specifics of how the performance was made. So this was an ethnodrama of a grief group for suicide loss survivors. the group itself is called Marigold, and I have been one of the organizers of this NGO for the last 7 years. And the writer for the play was also another member organizer of the group. I think I met her around 5 years ago. She lost her partner to suicide and came to the grief group while I was facilitating and organizing one of the grief group sessions. And we since developed a relationship in the group, friendship in the group. And basically the play took the form of the grief group meetings that we shared. And so there were 5 characters or 5 actors on stage that sort of sat around in almost a circle, like a half circle that resembles the actual grief group settings. But for the content of the play itself, the writer and the 2 clinical psychologists who organizes the NGO interviewed around 10 suicide survivors. I believe they recruited all of the survivors through Instagram, and a couple of them were invited over because they had clinical therapy sessions. Sorry, not clinical therapy sessions with the clinical psychologists who are part of the team. And so the psychologists themselves recruited the survivors to be a part of the project. And so what it basically means is that all of the content that was staged are true stories, true life stories and experiences of suicide survivors. And one of the struggles the writer had was to really do justice to the representation of these experiences, because the writer was fully aware how difficult it was to share one's deep, intimate stories of grief to another person, and especially knowing that this is going to be staged. And so the play was first staged in 2025, and 2026 was its second staging. And in the first year, they didn't have much budget at all. I think the psychologist and the writer they personally funded the performance with very little money, basically around $2,500, which is really very little money to stage anything. And so the writer had to direct the play herself, and all of the actors were recruited by her from her connections back in the theater school. And so the actors were mostly participating because they loved the writer as a friend. And so this was a sort of, how should I put it, a friendship, a solidarity move to show their friend how much they want to support her through her own grief, if this is a life work that she needs to put out at this stage. But in 2026, interestingly, this is where the Korean Government Suicide Prevention Center comes into play. They decide to fund the play after seeing the first one, which is also a really interesting juncture of how suicide prevention governmental efforts or biopolitical efforts are encountering with the suicide loss survivors and grief. And so in 2026, they had almost 10 times the budget they did in the first year. And so they could recruit another director and a bunch of other actors the director wanted to hire. And also all these actors were paid unlike the first time in 2025. The interesting thing is the director was recruited in the second year was also a survivor of a kind. They lost their friend, the best friend of theirs from when they were 17. And it's been almost 20 years since they lost their friend. But it seemed like to me that they were in their very early stages of grief because they had never had the chance to process what had happened. And one of the interesting moments for me during the practice runs was that, or one of the dinners after the rehearsals was that the director kind of got drunk and said the name of the friend who died for the first time ever since they passed. And so it was that sort of intensity and different stages of grief that they were going through. A couple of actors also had experiences with losing their actor colleagues, and they were investing a lot of their personal wounds and emotions into the play through their own personal experience. Yes. And so I was invited to write an ethnography on the making of the second year's performance, based on the long-term connection with the NGO and the writer. And so I observed all of their practice runs and their stage rehearsals, spent time with them after their rehearsals, shared dinner, drank with them, which was another culture for me, which was an interesting culture to be a part of. I don't think I went out for those like overnight drinking sessions after my undergrad years, and so it was really interesting. And then I ended up conducting interviews of all of the creative team, including the director, writer, the actors, and others in the audio team or the design team, and I also conducted interviews of around 25 audience members after the show. And so in total, I did 35 interviews of this particular play. What was really interesting was the multiple layers of witnessing of grief that was happening during the process of creating this play. So the creative team were the witnesses to the writer and the suicide loss survivors who contributed their life stories. And I am talking about the creative team of 2026 instead of the 2025. Because the writer completely decided not to get too much involved in the second year. I think she was feeling a little drained after directing it and writing it the first year. She wanted to step out of it. And so the creative team most of the times had to guess what the writer was intending to write about while they were planning how to perform. And so they were the witness to the writer and the suicide loss survivors, basically the interviewees and the life stories of the interviews that was included in the script. The actors were also the witnesses to the director survivor. I think even more than the survivors who were the actor survivors, the director's experience of surviving suicide loss was more prominent in the group, probably due to power dynamics between the two different roles. And the director also edited the script a little bit to include characters that represent the director themselves. And so 2 characters were added and a couple of other characters were deleted from the original script. And the 2 characters were one, a teenager, a 17-year-old boy who lost their friend to suicide at school. And the other character was a 40-something-year-old man who has never processed any grief since their friend passed 10 years back. So those were the 2 characters that were added by the director, and I think the actors were very aware of what was happening psychologically with the director, because they were also literally in the same room trying to attempt to articulate whatever the director wanted with these 2 new characters. And so the audiences were also the witnesses to the play itself. As I was saying, the audience both included survivors and non-survivors, and some of the survivors were even the interviewees who contributed their stories to the play. And so these people were hyper aware of how their story was being represented, who represented it, and how the actors were sort of mimicking, quote unquote, mimicking their emotions on stage. And I think the stakes was much lower for the non-survivor audience, which we'll go into later in the presentation. And I, the anthropologist, was a witness to the creative team during the process. I was mostly just writing in the background. And I expected myself to just write in the background, just documenting as we mostly do. But then I ended up sort of taking the role of a dramaturgy, which happened because all of the actors, the creative team basically knew that I know the director from running these grief groups, and they also knew that means they also knew that I was a survivor. They didn't have much more information about my experience of loss, but they knew that I was also researching into the topic. And so what happened was at every corner of the script, when they didn't understand the emotions of the characters, or if they didn't understand the transition in the script, they try to ask me to understand in an indirect way to get to the emotions of the interviewees who contributed their stories. And so in that process, I think they got to experience me more as both as a researcher, as a dramaturgy, but also as a survivor. And so there was the really interesting dynamics of everyone witnessing each other, analyzing each other in a particular way. I think I was almost feeling a little afraid that I was being seen too much by the creative team as a person, and so it was interesting. So this is the whole setting of the play, and to get into the details of how the creative team worked as witnesses. I just want to go quickly into how the writer felt like when she was writing the story of Yeol, the audio file, the character in the audio file that I just showed at the very beginning of the presentation. So when she first met Yeol, I think there was a sort of an underlying trust that they could trust each other with their life stories because they were both suicide survivors. But then the writer was also saying that she felt a little hint of disdain from the interviewee, Yeol, because the person she lost, the interviewee lost, was her child, versus the person who the writer lost was the unmarried partner. And so what's being prominent in this particular episode is the hierarchy of grief that I often observe in the field. And the grief of parents who lost their child are at the forefront of, or are considered to be the most agonizing of all the different types of grief. And even though sometimes people want to acknowledge the grief of different positions, or different relationships as the same thing, the pain itself cannot be comparable. I think there's also a tension when it comes to the actual conversations when people start to share their experiences. And so the comparison of pain, the comparison of the severity of grief is always underlying, is always like the undercurrent of these conversations. And I think the writer very vividly felt it while she was interviewing Yeol. And so this was a task for her to deal with. She needed to do justice to the grief of the mother, while feeling the disdain and contempt and the sort of paradoxical trust from her, which I think was transmitted to the actors as well. So this wasn't just a tension that the writer was feeling, but the entire group of the creative team was feeling the same thing. And they also knew that the Yeol, the person, will be at the theater too as an audience. And so they really didn't want to reignite any of her wounds while presenting the shape of her wounds, almost dissecting the shape of her wounds to public, which was a really difficult task for a lot of people. And then there were different reactions to how the creative team was dealing with this particular impossibility of the task itself. And I think a lot of it stemmed from the disparities in the process of dealing with the grief. And as I was saying, the director was paradoxically, despite the fact that she lost the friend the longest time before than anybody else, she was at her earlier stages of processing her grief. And so I think the easiest thing for her was to sort of put certain things away that she couldn't really analyze too delicately. I think she was trying to be responsible in that way, and to protect the interviewee when she comes to the theater. While I think the writer wanted to more face-to-face deal with the grief itself or the tension itself, which was more evident in the first version of the script in the first year. I could also feel the heaviness in the air and the delays in practice runs in every single practice runs for this performance. And so people usually spent at least 4 to 5 hours per session to do the rehearsals for a play that ran for 72 minutes. And so in my imagination, they could run at least 2 or 3 rehearsals if they wanted to, but then they would spend the first hour and a half just chit-chatting, doing small talk, and deliberately saying that they really don't want to go into the practice of the play because they feel the heaviness in the air so much they don't want to look into the grief, and it was bringing on a lot of their personal sense of grief that they didn't want to face, and so there was the resistance and the struggle, despite the fact that they are a part of this team. And so I think one of the really interesting strategies that they took was thinking about replacing the grief with the feeling of something else. So for instance, the character who played Yeol, the mother that I just showed you, she was saying that she thought she was failing at depicting the grief exactly the way it is because she's never had a child before. And so she asked another actor who has a child and who's experiencing the child being hurt in certain ways, like when they were running around and scraped their knees, for instance, and the injuries that came, the emotional injuries the parent experienced, if there was a slight literal injury to their child. And then she wanted to imitate that emotion on stage as a feeling that, as the shape of grief, which I thought was a really interesting, but a very limiting scope of how the audiences might experience grief. Just because in a lot of my interviews with the survivors, the mothers say that they can't, the pain that they're going through is unimaginable even for them while they're experiencing it. And so there is this sense of, unspeakability, but also unimaginability of the pain itself, despite the fact that they are already experiencing it. And the way the actor was trying to replace that grief with a much minor injury was very much understandable while limiting a strategy, which I think inevitably ended up being the failure that a lot of audience got enraged with. Another really interesting strategy that they took was actually, I think, executed by the actor who's here present today at the talk, Bomi. And what they did was, so they played three different roles. The same actor played three different roles. One was a dog of one of the characters. The other was the 17-year-old boy who lost their friend at school. And the last character they played was the spirit of the daughter who died by suicide. And the transition between the 17-year-old boy and the spirit characters happened in a single scene where the actor starts talking as a 17-year-old, and then very slowly transition into speaking to the mother, as if she is the daughter who died by suicide. And then what the actor later recalled in our interview was that they didn't want to make any backstories for the daughter character, and they didn't want to embody the dead daughter herself, but just wanted to be the image of the daughter that the mother wished was back. And so the daughter character herself was sort of depicted as this very flattened and simplified image. But they were saying that because they only wanted to play this as an image, they were trying to be the witness to the grief of the mother instead of actually getting into the grief of losing their own life. And it sort of ended up making them feel like they were touching the grief of the mother on stage when the two hugs on stage. And I wanted to show a very quick video clip of the rehearsal of the scene.
엄마도 어려웠을 거야. 정답을 맞히기 어려운 문제라 보고 싶지 않아진 거 이해. 그러니까 엄마 너무 괴로워하지 마. 엄마가 너무 고통스러워하면 내가 너무 못돼 보이잖아. 물론 전부 내 탓이지만. 아니야. 엄마가 진짜로 그렇게 우리 가미한테는 사랑하는 마음만 잔뜩 보내주고 엄마 많이 안 슬퍼.
So this is the first scene ever that they actually have physical contact. And for the rest of the play, people are mostly sitting in their own seats. And the actor recalled that when they hugged, she could literally feel the body of this mother character trembling in her arms. And it felt like she was touching the emotion itself, the emotion of grief itself. And the creative team as witnesses, they were also the witness to the anthropologist turned dramaturgy and an object of observation. And they asked me a lot of my personal experience, my researcher experience about grief. And many times I told them, when I answer their questions, I basically tell them that there are so many different shades of grief. And so basically they can perform anything they actually feel like performing, which they later recalled as a freeing interpretation. And so while they were feeling a lot of heaviness due to the responsibility that they're feeling in the face of the interviewees who will come to see their performance, I think my interpretations gave them a sort of a justification of what they have already been working on. And a really interesting aspect of this creative team was that they also share an experience of knowing a teenager who is attempting suicide multiple times during when they put on put on another play together a year before. And this teenager also reserved a seat for the play as the first person. Like, she literally reserved a seat right after the form was open, and everyone was aware that she was going to be there, and they were afraid of her getting really triggered by some of the stories. But also they wanted this to be a healing experience for her. And so during the practice runs and rehearsals, the presence of these teenagers was constantly in the air. They were constantly talking about her, and trying to tweak what they were performing based on what they know about this particular person. And so I think they were trying to execute a sort of an act of care for, sometimes imagined, but other times real audience who would come see their performance. So there were a lot of strategic approaches and constant struggles. Not all of them succeeded. When the teenager actually came to watch, she later posted on Instagram about the suicidal thoughts she had while watching the show, while watching the play. But at the same time, she said she felt a lot of overwhelming love from all of the actors who were on stage that she personally knew. And so despite the fact that I named this presentation as Performing for Failure, I think it was more of what does even failure mean for these actors, even when they were presenting, or even when they were preparing themselves for the worst thing that could happen. I also conducted an audience poll for audience poll right after the play was done. And I asked people which character they want to talk to the most. And I think it made sense. 38% chose the mother character, Yeol, that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation. But really, the other really interesting thing was the next person coming up was Chunyu, the 40-year-old man that represented sort of the persona of the director who lost their friend 10 years back and is barely attempting to process their grief for the first time after 10 years, which I will get into later in the presentation too. And I also asked them how they were feeling at this moment right after they watched the play, and some of them were saying they feel guilt, they feel empathy. They say they miss the loved ones. They feel warmth, beauty, but emptiness. Also, some of them said they wanted to die. They were having suicidal thoughts. Some of them were thinking of their dogs. Some of them were consoled. Others were feeling complicated and sadness. And doing the audience interviews after the play was almost like a devastating experience for me, because the range of reactions were so broad. At first, I don't think I was capable of making sense of all these different reactions, because some of them were actually enraged against the play itself. There was one interview who literally called it a quote unquote trash. And there were people who said the rage that was represented in the play itself, they felt like their own rage, they feel as survivors against the dead, or against their family members or their friends who were grieving together, was represented well in the play, and so they felt like a cathartic release of their anger sometimes. And other times they were feeling affection towards some of the characters, and especially the mothers, the mother survivors who lost their children came in as interviewees, and they said they were really seeing the friends of her child from their children from the 17-year-old boy character, and they were projecting a lot. They really loved that character. And then there was this sort of unsatisfied appreciation from other audiences. other survivor audiences, where they said, "Oh, I'm not happy about the story itself, but I am happy that some of my experience was represented on stage as something that people can see, and they want to hear more of other people's grief." As I said, some people were triggered, others were feeling a lot of love, but I really want to highlight two interesting emotions, which was one was numbness. People wouldn't report numbness, but I could witness certain survivors going completely numb during the play, because I invited a lot of my interlocutors from the field, a lot of survivors to the play. And I remember this one mother who lost her child, just sitting through the entire play, not shedding a single tear, not reacting once. She would never laugh at any of the jokes in the play. She would not even move her head when the actors were moving around the stage. And so she was completely numb. She was not turning her head when everybody else was turning their head. And I almost felt like she was completely frozen for the entire running time of 72 minutes. And I wanted to ask her what the numbness was afterwards, but she has been avoiding to answer since. I still do see her in the field as my interlocutor, but she wouldn't comment on it. And I can only guess what this numbness means, which basically was how people were subletting their own memories and experiences instead of actually following the content of the play itself. And this summoning includes memories that they can't forget, the traumatic memories that constantly flood their everyday life. But also they summon memories that were completely forgotten. And so when I said at the beginning of the presentation that 50% of the audiences identify themselves as survivors and the 50% didn't, a lot of them reported afterwards in the interview that they changed their minds after a few days. They saw the play because it sort of summoned their long forgotten friends who they lost to suicide back in high school, or their far cousins or far relatives that they lost by suicide that they completely deleted from their memories, and they were all coming back. And so it was really interesting to see how people were slowly adjusting to the term of suicide loss survivor, and trying to experience the grief in a very new sense. I know we're running out of time, so I'll end my talk with this slide, and leave the rest. I think the one takeaway that was really stunning for me by the end of this particular research was that everyone was more concerned with their own experience of grief, and that's what they were summoning to this particular time and space of the play. I couldn't make sense of this at the very beginning, but I ended up realizing that this is only natural because of what grief, the sort of narcissistic at times aspect of grief, that grief itself contains people in the harshness of their own pain, and sometimes stops them from empathizing with others, which is what I'm realizing a lot in other grief group meetings as well. But there are stages to this. People don't always stay in this stage. They would often reemerge from this closeness of their own grief and empathize so much more or understand so much more about life and pain afterwards. more expensively that reaches outside the scope of suicide loss, but any other loss or grief that includes that includes grief of some really important political moments in Korea, which leads the survivors to participate in events to show their solidarity with Sewol-ho or Itaewon disasters. So there are like famous cases of disasters with more than 100 people being sacrificed, and a lot of suicide survivors are showing their solidarity to these. And the actors were experiencing this sort of closeness or self-centeredness of the grief experience of the audience while they were performing. And the Yeol actor, she recalled this later as the audience is not the warm kind. Despite the fact that the actors or the creative team was always aware of how to take care of the audience emotions or audience's grief, the connection wasn't necessarily happening in reciprocal ways. I think I'm investing more into understanding the conditions of how collective connections through grief can happen through my research. And so I'll end my presentation here. And if you have any questions, please do ask away. And thank you so much for listening.
Amazing what you want. So interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You see so many hands.
Thank you so much for listening to such a long presentation. I'm sorry.
I looked at my watch and I was like, oh my God, it's been 50 minutes. It didn't feel like that at all. Just really fascinating stuff. I have a million questions, but I have other opportunities to talk to you. So I'm not gonna,
So we should
let other people jump in.
Connor, I see your comments. Thank you so much. I'll copy and paste this so I can also read it later too, but I'll read it right now. Thank you.
So you can exit out of the AI.
That looks like a question.
Connor, do you want to read out or state your question? Or do you want me to read it?
It's more of a comment. But yeah, excellent job, Yoon Won. This was a fascinating presentation. I love the ethnodrama angle. I loved the details about the physiological symptoms of grief and the discussion of the embodiment of grief in the context of theater. The paradox of like, how do you embody something that is unspeakable or unimaginable? I really liked that. And I liked how your exploration looks at both actors and the audience through multiple layers of witnessing grief. And I liked your discussion of like the hierarchy of grief, and also that you touched upon the audience's expressions of rage at the play. Also, I mean, you're saying this is just a chapter, but you have so much data here between all of your hours of participant observation and total interviews. So extremely impressive. And yeah, like all of your hard work shows, and yeah, I'm really impressed. Great job.
Thank you so much, Connor. I think I really missed sharing my work with the lab, with you in it too. Thank you.
Suppose I could ask a question if nobody else is waiting. Throughout your presentation, you described quite a few obstacles or things that didn't happen the way you thought that they might. And I wonder if you feel like you have insights into something that would make this kind of format more what you expected it to be, or whether upon reflection it's simply not the kind of thing you can do in this format. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense. I'm trying to think on my feet. I don't think my research was orienting towards thinking about how to make my expectations come true. But I am invested in how people might feel connected to each other's grief. And I think my temporary conclusion, I think, is really about the slow time that people spend together. And so what theater performances allow for the audience and actor or the creative team to do is to have like a really intense contained time and shared time and space in a ritualistic way, which doesn't necessarily happen over accumulated time of sharing the understanding of grief of each other's experiences. And so I think I don't particularly see how this particular format of theater could contribute to deeper connections through grief collectively. But I do believe long-term accumulated time of constant struggles of interpreting each other's experiences through grief groups, for instance, or through long-term relationships, could possibly bridge that connection a little bit.
Yeah.
Thank you for your question. Sorry.
A follow-up question on that. So, first of all, I just thought this was just so fascinating and so many different thoughts. So I have some experience with verbatim theater, and this similarities to that, right? You're interviewing people, you're taking, but then the big question that I had was, so in verbatim theater, sometimes you stick very, very close to the narratives, right? And then sometimes you're off from them. And I think that, it's not just the question of whether theater can have the kind of cathartic effect that you were talking about earlier, but like what kind of, like, it's an art form, right? So it can be done well, it can be done poorly, it can be done in all sorts of different ways. So so my question is kind of like, how verbatim was where the performances. It also looked a lot for like verbatim theater, because they're like, at first I thought this is like a theatrical staging, and then I see, like, from the pictures you shared, they're actually sitting kind of in a semicircle, and they've got music stands in front of them, so it looks like they're reading from text. So it's like a lot like a kind of verbatim performance, but was it really close to the stories? Because I would think, just from my limited experience, that if you're seeing like the literal words that you shared, that would have a different impact than if you're seeing some interpretation of those words. Do you know what I mean? That like veers off from what you said.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So it started off as I think for the first year, definitely there was no acting, there was no performing, and people were just reading off the scripts. And in the second year, it started off as reading, but then the director wanted to incorporate parts of the different scenes that were more impactful to be acted out, to be performed with the bodies of the actors. And this year, in 2026, actually. Sorry, I think I mixed up the dates. I'm just realizing that I mixed up the dates. That happened in 2024 once, and I was writing the ethnography in 2025. And this year in 2026, I'm not writing the ethnography, but they are making one verbatim theater out of my ethnography. And so they wanted to write in almost like a documentary theater out of the process of the creation of the ethnography. And so I will be one of the anthropologist character in in the play. And so I'm meeting the writer in May. But they're also trying to stage this as an acted performance instead of reading it on stage this year as well. So there are like 2 tracks of different creation happening at this moment. I do wonder, you're right, Brandon, if I don't know what people might have felt if there were no reading portions and everything was acted out, if they felt like it was more embodied, if they felt less blocked by the reading itself, because some people were mentioning it during their interviews, that they felt hindered by the reading stands and things. I don't think I've thought it, considered it through enough, but I think that's a great question, and I'll consider it through while I work on the other verbatim theater this year. Thank you so much for the question.
Yeah.
Oh, it's okay.
Keio?
Hi. Thank you so much for the talk. I'm just like, my brain's going off in like so many directions, and it was fascinating to hear. Thank you so much. I have like 3 large things that you can respond to in any way that you can. The first one is, I wanted to invite you to possibly loop back to the deleted scene after the audience reaction, because I thought it was interesting in the ways that you started off by opening the talk by saying that it felt perhaps the director nixed it because it felt dangerous, and like how you maybe reflected upon that after the audience reactions, and like I thought it would be interesting to see how you maybe came back to that, because you knew as you were presenting what that would look like, but if you would chime us into what that looked like. The second piece was, I love the mechanisms of acting that you cue us into, and it really enlivens the scene and of how the audience reacted, especially the mechanisms that you show how like replacing the affect with a smaller affect to approximate like the unimaginable grief and for it to anger the audience. And I was curious whether you were going to go deeper into that or like to take that somewhere. And that was just fascinating. And I just wanted to ask, you know, if that was, or like just comment, this is really cool and really great. The third one was, I guess, more of a question of like, how are you seeing witnessing perhaps work as a particular maybe framework or an idea? How is it maybe different from watching, seeing, holding, or interpreting more specifically? Because you do use different terms interchangeably, and I know you always use these terms very particularly, and I want to invite you to maybe just share a little bit more on what type of scaffolding that you are, you know, keeping under the surface that is so very, very rich.
Thank you, Ion, so much for all the questions. And thank you for inviting me back to talking about some of the more important concepts as well. So with the deleted scene, the really interesting thing about this play was that it was stayed with the original script once the year before. And so some audience came twice, both the year before and this year. And so they knew which scenes were deleted and what were added. And so for those audience, I particularly asked them how they felt about the difference. And so the deleted scene, not just that, but the deleted scene mostly, I think, was accepted by the reception of the deleted scene to the audience who watched both were that it sort of took away the depth of the emotion of the survivors. But it comes from how should I put this? The question of deleting this particular seemingly violent, like a lot of people thought it was violent to hear someone taking down the body of their own child from a dangling string, basically, which is true. But then it really raises the question of what does it mean for people who haven't experienced the intensity of the thing to think it's violent, while the survivor herself has fully experienced it with their body, and is still living with the memory that it's constantly intrusive. I don't think she can ever forget that those two are the hands that did the CPR to the dead body of the daughter, right? And so while the survivor herself, is constantly living with these particular sentiments and the senses, literally body audience calling that violent, I think it really brings in a sort of a paradoxical understanding of what the ethics of representation should be in this case. And so I think I personally I think I also struggle with how much of the details of the scenes of death that I need to include in my ethnography. And I really try not to make it into almost like a pornographic description or of like flashing people with the intensity of the pain itself. But I really do want to respect what it meant for the survivors themselves to talk about it the way they do talk about, the way they describe it, and why they represented the way they called the name of the daughter while she did the CPR on her. And so if I be honest, I was quite outraged that the scene was deleted. I didn't say a thing to the director. I only consulted the psychologists and other organizers of the grief group to ask if this is appropriate, if they think it's okay. And we agreed that we will be critiquing how the second year went afterwards, instead of directly intervening with the decision itself, which was a difficult moment for me. And so I think there were clashes of ethics of representation that was happening on the spot as well. I don't know if that answered your first question. And with the replacing of the affect with a smaller affect, I think the actor herself completely thought of this as a failure. I think she expressed a lot of embarrassment with the failure, that she had no other means but to replace it with smaller affect, but also a smaller affect that she herself couldn't experience because she herself doesn't have a child, right? And then she was second guessing herself if she was recruited wrongly, and if someone who does have a child should be recruited for the job, which I later in a conversation with her, I told her that people with children sometimes can't imagine the pain of losing their children because it's too painful for them. There's the unimaginability of the death of their child falls equal to both people who do have children and who don't. And so it's really difficult to tell, like, if the current identities or the current experiences are the only things that are needed for these actors to empathize or to embody the grief that they were reading on script was what I was thinking. And witnessing as a concept, the later slides that I couldn't really present were more specifically about the theoretical aspect of witnessing, and I wanted to base it more on Veena Das's particular terms of witnessing, and witnessing as an ethical act of engraving others' pain on one's body itself. And so it isn't just about watching, but it's more about having almost like wounding traces of others' pain on one's body that one comes back to, interprets, constantly reinterprets in their own life, is what I'm trying to read it as. And hopefully I can dive more into it later in my actual chapter. Thank you for all of your questions. I know we're grossly running out of time, but Brendan, if you wanted to.
I don't know about the time. So I think my question was like a follow up to deeds. So I feel like have to go back to his question about format. But also, as you're kind of saying, maybe it's not the format. It's not just the way theater was done. Maybe let me start with maybe my own experience. Like I talking about two different groups who are highly traumatized. So I had an opportunity to work with the group of women who are currently going through domestic violence at the Center for Domestic Violence. And the other group was incarcerated women who have been in prison for over 2 decades, for many of them. So it was fascinating to me in the sense that whenever I came back with this, being a facilitator to lead or just have weekly meeting among women who are going through domestic violence, I almost always left the meeting feeling so dysregulated. I just felt like rage. Like it just was so much empathic distress. And I almost felt like this was the first time I felt like I just need to walk to some bar that is noisy that would wash out all of my kind of distress. So of course, Brendan, because I had to get into the car being in Atlanta, get back home. So he was a suffer from my kind of charging at him with like unreasonable emotional outrage. But in the meanwhile, many people think, prison must be a worst case because these women were imprisoned for over 2 decades, and many of them were not even trying to kill somebody, but who happened to be there. And yet, that had a very opposite impact on me. Each time we come back from teaching these women, we just felt like we are so inspired. We felt life is good. It was a very opposite kind of quality. And then because they were happening around the same time, it just very made me think a lot. And I think no matter what, perhaps, as you said, grief has many stages. And perhaps what was shown at the play were this raw experience of people. It's almost like people who are suffering, but with no insight to exit. They're in the midst of the pain. And when you watch that, maybe audience, when you say audience is not the warm group, what triggers for audience is this kind of what happened even to me. I never suffered from domestic violence myself, but also empathic distress. This woman who reacted with numbness very made me think about that. And I think somehow the very profound movies, which are dealing with very traumatic, incidents, have oftentimes either some insight or some message or some hope so that people feel, yes, my pain is heard, is shared, is understood, but I'm not stuck. There's kind of way out, there's some hope. So when you have that, audience would have very different reaction. So it just made me think about just showing the kind of pain experience as it is may not be helpful necessarily. But I don't know what else to say. If it's done with script writers or actors who went through that, but kind of, it's just like, I think these women who are at the prison went through the phase of rage and the feeling of unjust, being hurt, society treat them unjust. but they went through the anger and then rage and then realized that doesn't serve them any good. So they're at the different place. So maybe that's spending time with them was not painful experience, but experiential. So it's, I don't know to wrap it up, but that's kind of how I felt.
Thank you so much, Chicago. That's really insightful, and that really does make me think about things like that I completely forgot to mention as well. But you're absolutely right. There are different stages of grief, and it doesn't always feel the same to be in a group of survivors because of the emotions and different stages of grief that they're going through. You're absolutely right. The play itself shows the process of people going through rage, and then it does kind of come into the insights that people gain after that they've been through the burns of the grief. And so it sort of ends with what's important during the stages of grief is to not just fixate on the moment of the death itself, but to really reflect on who this person was and to remember them, to love them. And so there is a lot of talk about love and sort of this collective coming together on stage as like a later sort of as a representation of the later stages of grief, right? But what I realized with the audience interview is that people come in inevitably with different stages of experiencing their own grief, right? And they get hooked to different scenes. And so even though the staging itself flows into this more insightful understanding of grief as the writer herself is experiencing, I think she's at a much more peaceful stage right now where she is accepting her experiences. She's trying to recreate them through these artistic endeavors. And she's also doing like interviews on national TVs and like newspapers where she has where she is accumulating experiences to re-narrate her story to the public as well. And so the writer is reflecting her experience to the script, but people get hooked to the rage part, for instance. People get hooked to the guilt part. People get hooked to the love part. People get hooked to the self-harm part. And so it's really difficult to move the audience through the entire stages, emotional stages that are being represented in the play. And so I think part of the reason why I thought the collective catharsis was difficult was because the stickiness of the different stages that people are summoning in their own seats, if that makes sense. But you're absolutely right. I do feel the disparities in these stages of how people are processing, and it's part of the difficulties in the other chapters that I'm writing on grief group. But I hope we could talk more about it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. I think we should probably wrap up because we're at about an hour and 45 minutes. Stephen, I noticed you put your video on. Did you have a question or comment?
Only if we have a few more minutes. I would like.
Yeah, maybe just a couple more minutes.
Okay. So I feel like what you're doing is quite amazing, and I want to applaud you. I don't know if that's the right word in English, but for your work in it.
Thank you so much.
I'll try to make this brief, but it brought up so many thoughts and experiences, and it goes way back to when I was a young man and I was facilitated a support group for family members of people who had committed suicide. And I found it was clearly rewarding for everyone, but it also I felt somewhat disappointed in the level of sharing and I guess what you described as at the very end there about the lack of empathy, which was surprising to me in some sense. I thought everybody would be very empathetic. After that, I decided to go to get clinical training myself and practice, and I did that for about 20 years. And then about 20 years ago, again, I decided to do a kind of psychoeducation form of work. And so it was done within the context of a Stanford University course, but I called the course Trauma, Healing, and Empowerment. So it clearly drew people who had experienced some kind of trauma, and they wanted to be part of a group of people. It was limited to the size was like 15 students. And in some sense, it was very much like a support group or a self-help group, like an AA group, or just like the one I had done myself. And except that I facilitated it and I introduced it with my more than an AA type of facilitator would, by sharing my own vulnerability and sharing myself, my own story, and setting that kind of a stage. And one aspect I introduced was that I asked mostly women artists of color to come and share their form of art, which could be done in a very healing way. So a Japanese dance called Buto, that an artist came to share those kinds of exercises, and a taiko drummer came and we did something together, and somebody came and did a kintsugi, the kintsugi, that type of artwork with the pottery. And so I wanted to facilitate the process, the healing process, by having artists come and share their artwork. So it didn't have to be all verbal. But the thing I wanted to mention mostly was that what they started to tell me was that they were clearly at different stages of grief, and that they all had come with that sense of what I felt at the beginning, lack of warmth. And it was like each person was in their own grief so deeply that they thought, I'm here to receive something. I'm the one who's suffering. I need to receive something from you other people, and I deserve the attention. But they started to say that, share in their journals, that when somebody else said something and they realized, oh, I can help that. I have something to share because I'm at a different stage of grief, and I can share something. And that when they did that, they said that was their healing too. So in giving, they realized they were being healed, and they also were being released from that self-centeredness, and even, you said, narcissistic sense of it's all about me, it's all my own grief. And as they gave to others, they started to feel they were being healed as well. And so that that kind of a group has been something that I have tried to construct in different ways, but it isn't specifically about suicide, but it is generally a way of inviting each person in the group to bring forth their wounds or and then to share what they might have already learned with others in the group. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for those insights. You're absolutely right. I think a lot of survivors also end up being psychologists for the sake of helping others. And so it really depends on the stages, but also the characters, like the personalities of the survivors as well. And so I'm trying to figure out the sometimes not too much self-helping process of helping others by the survivors as well. Like they have internal struggles when they end up helping others. It's rewarding for them, but at the same time, it sometimes makes them neglect their own grief too. And so there are struggles of and tensions in that process as well. But I think you're doing really meaningful work, and I want to know more about the help groups that you're organizing. Thank you so much for coming and asking the question.
Sure, I'd be happy to share more with you and to talk more with you. I'd love and follow your work more. Thank you so much for the work you're doing.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for that, Stephen. Thank you, Yoon Won, for an amazing talk, wonderful conversation. And we look forward to having you back with us again in person soon too.
Thank you so much for also sitting through this very, very long talk. I apologize for how long it went.
Early in the morning. And everybody who's tuning in from East Asia, thanks for joining so early in the morning. Good.
Yeah, thank you very much. So maybe we stop the recording.
Okay, all right. Okay, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
And, see you next time.
Thank you.